David Blanchflower joins us. He's a professor at Dartmouth College, a Bloomberg contributing editor, and labor economist. This is your specialty area, David. Find a bright spot for me here.
Pretty hard to find a bright spot. I thought everybody got very worked up yesterday and thinking this was all going to be wonderful. I'm not sure what evidence they were basing it on. World economy is slowing. Evidence in the US is slowing. There's very little here I can't really find anything I can feel cheery about. Unemployment up, job creation, not enough to deal with inflows of people into the labor force. The participation rate's down, wage growth's down, hours aren't moving very much. There's lots of discouraged workers out there. So I'm afraid Danny Blanchflower is actually discouraged even more than I'm normally discouraged. There's nothing in here that could really cheer you up. And I don't know what Obama's going to say. This is really not very good news at all.
No, and in the jobs figure also, you look at temporary hiring, you're hoping maybe corporate America is putting out some testers saying, well, let's bring them on part-time, see if we want to, put some ink to the contract. 12,000 jobs declined, a draw there. That suggests that hiring going forward isn't going to get better.
Well, hiring going forward doesn't look to be getting better. And actually, if you look at the household account, which actually includes self-employed people, gardeners, and those sorts of people, not included in the non-farm payrolls, that was down 445,000. Now, people have talked about whether it was seasonal adjusting. I don't think that's the issue. It's about where does job growth come from. And I think one of the big issues, we've seen it in Europe, is when you start to talk about austerity, you start to talk about cutting, even before it comes, you scare the consumer off. You scare them off, you scare firms off, confidence falls, and that's what you see reflected in the job numbers. So this is even before austerity comes. The talk of it scares the consumer, and that's, I think, what we're really seeing here.
Well, what I keep hearing from executives, too, is that the wealth gap is widening. That's what they're seeing. They're seeing the wealthy purchasing. They're seeing everyone else hold on tightly to their pocketbooks. How much of a divergence are you seeing on that front?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of divergence in the US and also around the world. I think the evidence is that if you like, the median worker is seeing really poor nominal wage growth, real wage cuts, and they're sitting there and they're saying, well, gosh, how come all these people, bankers and others, seem to be doing well? Inequality is a big issue. And if you look at all the research, behavioral economics research, it certainly looks that relative things matter. If you're all in it together, you're all struggling, that's one thing. But if you see yourself as struggling, but other people doing really well, I think we have trouble here, trouble brewing. And it's hard to argue on the Hill that these arguments say that people making $2.5 million and more shouldn't pay any more taxes. I think that's a hard argument for the normal average working guy in America to deal with.
Well, it's maybe a point in the court of those who want to argue for more stimulus, but it is certainly hard to get that done given the emphasis on reducing spending right now. What does the economy need? If you were a central banker here, what would you be doing?
Well, I think Laura Tyson has a really good column today in the FT talking about the fact that we need to deal with the fiscal issues in the medium to long term, but we probably do need some kind of fiscal stimulus right now. She talks about the need for infrastructure spending focused on job creation. But I think what it does as a central banker, and I've been writing about this the last few days, this raises the prospect of further QE. It raises, the data we've seen in the UK in the last couple of days as well. I've been basically calling over the last week. I think what we'll probably see is this raises the prospect of more QE3 in the US by November, and perhaps even earlier than that in the UK. That's what we're going to see. How else are you going to get stimulus?
Well, what does QE3 look like?
Well, obviously Well, QE3, in some sense, is going to have to be broadly similar to what we've seen before, because the Fed is extremely limited in what it can buy. It can buy mortgage-backed securities and more asset purchases. That's what it means. It's like the old kind of open market operation. Perhaps in the UK it will mean purchases of private sector bonds, private sector assets. But the Fed can't do that without Congress approving, and it's not going to do that. But obviously, I think the Fed will be sitting thinking about, if we do it, what form would it take? And they're going to have to think about that.
David, I always like talking to you because you're very frank.
Trouble.
But I was just looking at an editorial you wrote in the New Statesman, and you said when you're looking at your home country of the UK that you think Osborne's policies will cause the second Great Depression, possibly. I mean, this is a huge warning for the developed world.
Well, the evidence in the UK is actually that growth over the last 2 quarters was 0. The National Institute yesterday brought out its forecast, a very distinguished organization in the UK with a long track record of forecasting. They brought out a forecast for the 3rd quarter of 0.1. So that would be growth over 3 quarters of 0.1%. And in their forecast, they actually say, if you look at how long would it take to get back to the level of output before the recession started, they're talking about 60 months. That would be the longest lasting recession in 100 years, including the 1930s. So double dip's not the big deal. It's very, very slow growth. This is a wake-up call to everybody, especially in the US, where the UK was this laboratory experiment, and it's quite clear right now that it looks to be failing and failing abysmally. Growth has been compromised, 0.1 over 9 months. So this is disastrous.
And elsewhere you have the ECB raising interest rates, making it that much harder, you think, for growth to come back elsewhere on the continent?
Well, I certainly think raising interest rates in Europe when there is no wage pressure, inflation is only around 2.7%, and much lower than that in many countries, and falling. And the data out this week suggests that producer prices are actually falling again. So no wage pressure, countries struggling, you raise interest rates, which makes it even harder for countries to survive. Countries like Spain, the people there are paying on variable rate mortgages, their interest rates tick up, growth is compromised there, and countries in Europe are interconnected. The UK trades a lot with Europe, so it just looks to me like classic errors by the macro authorities in many countries, by the fiscal authorities in most countries, and it's hard to see how we're going to get out of this without more stimulus. It looks like the policymakers are doing exactly the wrong things.
All right. David Blanchflower, thanks so much for joining us.